Time Radio, every Saturday at 5 p.m. on AM 560. Explore the wonderful world of wine with host James Crooker and Rob Lehner.
Only the biggest stories, only the biggest guests, and only the biggest opinions. This is AM 560, The Answer.
Good morning, Dan, and in for Amy this morning is Sean from Elmwood Park. And
same size yoga pants, just a little shorter in the inseam.
Yeah. That is a real visual you've given the listeners.
Thank you.
So it turns out that the Death with Dignity movement is terribly undignified and, frankly, a bit barbaric. We're seeing this play out in a number of cases. This is a watered-down version of the Charlie Gard case across the pond. This is an important discussion to have in the context of government-run health insurance and thus...
Why don't we just say rule?
And thus healthcare decisions. And we talked about a couple of cases earlier. I mean, people think that this stuff is just unfathomable. This doesn't happen here, and it can happen here, and it never happens here. And nobody believes in infanticide, except University of Chicago ecology professor. And nobody would treat disabled persons as less than human, except those who promote aborting any person with a mental or physical disability, except those in Oregon who've taken children away from two parents who are mildly intellectually disabled, but who both have earned high school diplomas in the traditional way. So that can't happen here, except it's happening here. And and now in D.C., by the way, this week, the Death with Dignity Act, which was passed last year, Washington, D.C., allows terminally ill D.C. residents over the age of 18 to legally obtain a physician's prescription for medications to end their lives in a, quote, humane and peaceful manner. The individual must work with doctors and pharmacies licensed in D.C. that are willing to prescribe and dispense the lethal medications. Limitations on why you want to take your life? No. So for more on this topic, we're joined by someone who I've read for a long time. I don't know that there's a person in America, an academic, an intellectual in America who's written more on this topic to keep this in the public, the center of the public's attention, to try and bring it to people's attention, and more persuasively. He's Wesley Smith, Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism, and he joins us now. Wesley, thanks for joining us again. Appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Good morning.
Good morning. So why don't we start with the Death with Dignity Act and the move for euthanasia, not just in D.C., but also on the West Coast and into the Pacific Northwest as well, and the implications of this movement that sort of got the Orwellian title that masks the gruesomeness of the practice.
Yeah, it seems to me that when a movement depends on euphemisms to sell its wares, there's something wrong with the movement. You see that with the Death with Dignity moniker, and instead of calling it assisted suicide, they call it aid in dying. And the argument is that if somebody's terminally ill and they commit suicide, it's not really suicide because they were going to die. They didn't want to really die. They wanted to live, so it's aid in dying. It's all very convoluted, and it's all very Orwellian. The main organization in this country, not the only one, but the main one that pushes this is Compassion and Choices, which is it's a euphemistic title. Its original title was the Hemlock Society, which was honest. And Compassion and Choices is funded in the millions of dollars every year by George Soros and others of that mindset. And they are, we hear the few times they win, but, in 25 to 35 states each year, there are constant efforts to legalize assisted suicide. And it's a constant struggle to keep fighting it back because the movement runs on emotion. Rather than logic and rather than principle and rather than honest discourse. Quite often, I get a little upset when this is so I can die with dignity, meaning taking poison. I don't like to use the term medications because medications are supposed to heal. What they are is allowing doctors to prescribe an overdose of poison. And that means that my mom, who died of Alzheimer's last August, naturally, under the care of hospice in my home, didn't die with dignity because she didn't kill herself. Or that my dad in 1984, who died of colon cancer, didn't die with dignity because he didn't kill himself. I think we should push back against this nonsense language that is used by the movement, and also push back against the fear-mongering that drives the advocacy.
Well, I've got a question for you, Wesley. I'm a little. Let me explain my position. We did a story earlier about how there were advocates for people who, if you didn't have a certain IQ level, they basically wanted a post-birth abortion on kids, which I am vehemently against. Okay, but I do have a question.
Yeah, Peter Singer of Princeton would be one of those.
Right. Jerry Coyne at University of Chicago.
I do have a question philosophically for you. Okay, and this is just me asking you. I believe if you're not in control of your own life, what are you in control of? So, for instance, in theory, I believe if I am in full capacity and I decide that I don't want to burden anybody or my children, I should be allowed to go off on a boat with a bottle of wine and a shotgun and do what I have to do, theoretically. Now, I don't want the state to put me to. So, where do you put people like me?
Well, theoretically, you can do that because there's no law against that. The question, and by the way, we're not talking about you going out and saying I've had enough, like Hemingway, right, and killing yourself. We're talking about a joint enterprise in making you dead in assisted suicide. That must be fought tooth and tongue. The next question is, how does a compassionate and loving society respond when you decide you've had enough and you want to kill yourself? Do we respond by saying, okay, here's the shotgun, or do we respond by saying, look, let's find another way around the problems that are causing you this issue? If we're not going to do that, we might as well just fold the doors of suicide prevention organizations.
Well, also, too, I mean, it's interesting that the way you phrase that, because it calls to mind the recent case where that girl was convicted of involuntary manslaughter for encouraging her boyfriend to commit suicide, goading him into it and sending him denigrating texts. So wait a second. If he wanted to do it and she facilitated him, how is she different than the Death with Dignity movement?
Well, in that situation, which I haven't written about, I have questions about when somebody's saying, jump, 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 which is basically what she did, right?
Right.
Versus, let me cock the gun, let me put the gun in your hand, let me put the finger on the trigger, now just squeeze. I mean, there's a difference between those. And
well, right, but
as a believer in the First Amendment, I'm not sure that conviction was appropriate, even though I think what she did was despicable.
Well, no, I agree with you, but my point is to say she did that. She's convicted of manslaughter. This is, as you say, giving you the gun, cocking the gun, pointing it at you, and performing your hand around it, and this is dignified.
Yeah. Well, yeah, and there's another case in Minnesota which was an internet kind of situation where the same kind of goading and pushing, and somebody killed themselves and there was a conviction. But I think we also have to consider, when we push assisted suicide on one hand and then say, oh, but we have to stop suicide on the other, you're no longer anti-suicide, by some suicides. And it strikes me that if you tell somebody, let's say somebody who loses their business and has a scandal of some sort, and they want to kill themselves, and you say, no, don't do it. But then the person says, well, but I have cancer, and then you say, oh, here are the pills. It's like saying to somebody, don't smoke, but if you smoke, use a filter cigarette. I mean, there is suicide promotion in this assisted suicide movement that is going to impact other people who watch it, who may not, have the illness that currently technically qualifies for assistance. You see it in the movie industry. There's the, Me Before You and $1 Million Baby, where people with disabilities were, the whole message was it was right for them to kill themselves because how can you have a decent life with such disabilities? The disability rights movement are some of the most vociferous fighters of assisted suicide. They're not pro-life on abortion. They don't tend to be religious. They tend to be very liberal politically. But they say, good grief, we're the targets. And they're right about that. And by the way, once you accept these premises, let's take a look at what's happened in Belgium, which has gone much further down the road than the United States. They euthanize mentally ill people, and not with physical illness, mentally ill people. They can join it with organ harvesting. There have been at least 3 examples of joint elderly couples being euthanized together, not because they were sick, but because they were afraid of future suffering in terms of grief should one of them die. You've had a transsexual person euthanized because the person was unhappy with the sex change surgery. Really, once you accept the premise that killing is an acceptable answer to human suffering, you really have opened the door to an unlimited descent into the chasm. And people will say, well, that's slippery slopeism. No, those are facts on the ground. I'm not saying this is what could happen. I'm saying that is happening now in Netherlands and Belgium and beginning to happen in Canada, where I know that at least one mentally ill person was killed by permission of court order.
And you started at the outset of our conversation by referencing who's behind financially this movement, mentioning George Soros. And I think it's important to understand the perspective of those that are the advocates and the financiers. And the perspective, at least in part, is a ZPG, zero population growth perspective. It's there are too many humans on the planet. It is a post-Christian, all suffering is bad and suffering should be eliminated, and that includes eliminating the sufferer as needed perspective. And you know, it's what Dan Savage, the Dickensian-named activist in this front, said, you know, that we should have mandatory abortion because there's just too many damn people in the world. It's important for people to get over their shock that these human beings exist, and this is what they're advocating, but that's what they're saying in their own words.
Right, and it all hides behind gooey compassion, which is a false compassion, because compassion really means, the root meaning of the word is to suffer with, where we help each other through these dark times and take somebody else's suffering upon ourselves if necessary to do that. Assisted suicide is not suffering with. It is abandonment. It may not be intended to be abandonment, but it is abandonment, and it moves on emotion. The Brittany Maynard case is an example where you know, the euthanasia movement had been looking for just the right face to be the face of the movement, and they found it in this beautiful woman with the tragic situation of brain cancer. So now every time, and the media, by the way, is totally in the tank with this movement. In most stories about assisted suicide, you never even see an opponent able to discuss their perspectives anymore, or if they do, it's at the very end of the story, or it's somebody who's a priest so that they can say, well, this is just about religion, when it isn't. And Brittany Maynard, in her own writing, said she did it for 2 reasons. One was she was afraid of suffering, which one can understand. She never tried hospice care. She was told basically the worst-case scenario. You could tell it in her writing. There's a wonderful hospice doctor, Dr. Ira Byock, and your listeners can look him up, who tried to say, wait a second, it doesn't have to be the way she's discussing it. And he was yelled at on the media, how dare you discuss her case? He wasn't discussing her case. He was saying, look, even with brain cancer, there's things medicine can do to help alleviate this kind of symptoms. But the second thing that she said was, I don't want my family to see me undergoing this. In other words, I'm going to put myself out of my family's misery. If we get to a place where we're saying, you know what, I don't want my family to see me go through these experiences, it's that disintegrating of family. Part of being family is caring for each other in times of dire circumstances. And that is what family is in large part about. And to say, well, rather than have that, we'll just kill ourselves, can also lead to families saying, why don't you put yourself out of our misery? You know, it's a very, when you start make killing an answer to suffering, the mindset changes to 180 degrees, and things that you would never perceive of otherwise you will go there by logical extension.
He is Wesley Smith, Senior Fellow at the Discovery Institute Center for Human Exceptionalism. Wesley, thanks for joining us. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
And he joined us on the Turnkey.pro answer line.